In the fall of 1983, Wolfsburg was a city still shaped by the post-war economic miracle. With just under 120,000 inhabitants, it was considered a prime example of German prosperity and order. The Volkswagen factory dominated not only the economy, but also social life. Here, everyone knew each other, reputation was important, and unwritten rules passed down through generations were strictly observed. This was the environment in which the Hoffmann family grew up, a family that outwardly embodied everything one would imagine an exemplary German household to be. The Hoffmanns' two-story detached house was located on Lessingstrasse, a quiet residential area in the south of the city. The front yard was always well kept, the hedges neatly trimmed, and the sidewalk in front of the house was swept twice a week. Klaus Hoffmann, the father, was 46 years old and had been working as an engineer at Volkswagen for 25 years. He was a man of strict discipline who left the house punctually at 7 o'clock and returned at 6 o'clock. His wife, Helga, 44, ran the household with the same precision. She was a trained nurse, but had given up her career when the children were born. Every Sunday morning, the family attended services at the Protestant church on the market square, and every other Saturday, they invited neighbors over for coffee. The family's two children, Matthias and Katharina, were described by everyone as well-behaved. Matthias was 22 years old, had just completed his mechanical engineering studies in Braunschweig, and had returned to Wolfsburg for an internship. He was a tall, slender young man with dark blonde hair and a serious expression that gave him a certain degree of authority. His younger sister, Katharina, was 19 and attending night school to catch up on her high school diploma. She had brown curls that fell over her shoulders and large green eyes that often had a dreamy expression. Katharina worked during the day as an office clerk in a small insurance agency to finance her education. Matthias and Katharina had been close since childhood. As children, they had played in the garden for hours, learned to ride bikes together, and helped each other with their homework. Their parents encouraged this bond, seeing it as a sign of family cohesion. But over the years, this relationship had changed without their parents noticing at first. While Matthias was studying in Braunschweig, Katharina wrote him letters regularly, not only about everyday things, but also about her deepest thoughts and fears. Matthias replied in equal detail, and an emotional dependence began to grow. When Matthias returned to Wolfsburg in the summer of 1983, there was great joy. The family organized a welcome party in the garden to which relatives and neighbors were invited. Klaus gave a short speech in which he expressed his pride in his son, and Helga served homemade cake. Matthias and Katharina sat next to each other on the garden bench and talked quietly while the guests offered their congratulations. Mrs. Schultz, the neighbor across the street, later remarked to her friend that the two seemed unusually intimate with each other, but no one paid much attention to this comment. In the weeks that followed, Matthias and Katharina spent a lot of time together. Matthias helped his sister prepare for her high school exams, and Katharina accompanied him on walks through the city. Their parents were happy about this, interpreting it as a sign that the siblings maintained a close bond, even as adults. Klaus once remarked to Helga that he was glad his children got along so well. In many families, they would drift apart after childhood. Helga agreed and added that this was proof of their successful upbringing, but behind this apparent normality, something was developing that no one suspected. Matthias and Katharina began arranging secret meetings. At night, when their parents were fast asleep, Matthias would sneak into Katharina's room, and they would talk for hours. At first, it was just conversation about their dreams, their fears, their view of the world. Katharina talked about her longing to get away from Wolfsburg and lead her own life, far from her parents' strict expectations. Matthias confessed that he had often felt lonely in Braunschweig and that only her letters had given him support. These conversations brought them closer together, and over time, the boundaries of their relationship shifted. In September 1983, the dynamic between them changed fundamentally. One evening, when their parents were at a church event, Matthias and Katerina were left alone in the house. They sat in the living room and listened to music, a Peter Maffay record that Katerina had requested. The mood was relaxed, almost melancholic. Matthias talked about how much he had missed his sister during his years in Braunschweig, and Katerina replied that she had often felt lost without him. At that moment, something happened that neither of them could later reconstruct exactly. A hug that lasted too long, a look that became too intense. They kissed, and although they both knew it was wrong, they couldn't stop. In the weeks that followed, they met regularly in Katerina's room when their parents were asleep. They agreed on codes to coordinate their meetings. If Katerina said at dinner, "I have a long day ahead of me tomorrow," it meant they would see each other that night. When Matthias mentioned that he had something to do in the basement, it was a signal that he would come to her later. This ambiguity allowed them to remain unnoticed, but at the same time it intensified their feelings of guilt and secrecy. The social atmosphere in Wolfsburg in 1983 was characterized by conservatism. The city was strongly Catholic and Protestant, and moral values played a central role in social life. The church regularly preached about the sanctity of the family, and violations of this order were severely condemned. The Hoffmanns were active members of the congregation, and Klaus even sat on the church council. Any form of scandal would have destroyed not only the family, but also their social standing. Matthias and Katerina were aware of this fact, and this fear reinforced their isolation. In October, the parents noticed the first changes. Katerina often seemed absent and tired. Helga asked several times if everything was okay, but Katerina blamed it on the stress of work and school. Matthias spent an unusual amount of time at home and declined invitations from friends. Klaus interpreted this as a sign that his son was concentrating on his professional future and was satisfied. But one evening, Mrs. Schultz, the neighbor, noticed that the light was still on in Katerina's room late at night, even though she usually went to bed early. She mentioned this casually to Helga, but Helga dismissed it, saying that Katerina was just preparing intensively for her exams. At the beginning of November, something happened that further complicated the situation. Katerina noticed that her period had not come. At first she thought it was due to stress, but when nothing happened in the second month either, her panic grew. She didn't dare tell Matthias about it, fearing that this would make it all even more real. Instead, she secretly bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy in another part of town where no one knew her. The result was positive. Katerina broke down in her room and cried for hours. She knew that this could destroy not only her life, but also that of her family. It was late at night, and they were sitting in her room when she confessed to him in a trembling voice that she was pregnant. Matthias turned pale and was silent for a long time. Then he asked if she was sure, and Katerina nodded through her tears. The two sat there, unable to think clearly. Matthias suggested that they see a doctor, but Katerina refused. Every doctor in Wolfsburg would ask questions, and the risk of the truth coming out was too great. They considered going to Hamburg or Hanover, where no one knew them, but that also seemed too risky. In the weeks that followed, they tried to act as normal as possible. Katerina continued to go to work and school, even though she often felt nauseous. She wore loose-fitting sweaters to hide her changing figure. Matthias was torn between feelings of guilt and a desperate desire to find a solution. He considered whether they should run away, somewhere where no one knew them, where they could start a new life. But he knew that this was unrealistic. They had no money, no contacts, and such a move would immediately arouse suspicion. Her parents noticed that something was wrong, but couldn't say exactly what it was. Helga noticed that Katerina often didn't eat anything at breakfast and looked pale. She suspected a cold or exhaustion and urged her daughter to take better care of her health. Klaus noticed that Matthias was often still awake at night when he went to the bathroom, but he attributed this to him getting used to student life. Outwardly, the family continued to function perfectly. They went to church, received guests, and took part in community celebrations. But within the four walls of the house, a tension was growing that would soon be impossible to hide. At the end of December 1983, shortly before Christmas, Katerina could no longer completely hide her pregnancy. Helga noticed that her daughter had gained weight and asked her with concern if she was feeling well. Katerina evaded the question and said that she had been eating more lately because her schoolwork was so stressful. Helga accepted this explanation at first, but a feeling of unease remained. On Christmas Eve, as the family sat together in the living room singing Christmas carols, Katerina felt a distinct movement in her belly for the first time. She was so startled that she got up and excused herself to her room. Matthias followed her shortly thereafter and found her sitting on the bed with her head buried in her hands. The year 1984 began with a deceptive calm for the Hoffman family, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing that would soon shake everything up. The first weeks of 1984 brought a reality for Katerina Hoffman that she could no longer ignore. Her belly was now clearly visible under the loose-fitting sweaters she wore, and morning sickness had become a constant companion. She had to leave the office several times a day to vomit in the bathroom, and her colleagues began to exchange concerned glances. One morning, Ms. Bergman, the office manager of the small insurance agency, asked her directly if she should see a doctor. Katerina smiled awkwardly and explained that she had probably eaten something bad. The lie burned on her tongue, but she had no other choice. At home, the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Helga Hoffman was not a naive woman. As a trained nurse, she had worked in the maternity ward for years before giving up her profession. She was familiar with the signs of pregnancy, but at first she refused to accept the obvious. Katerina was her daughter, 19 years old, unmarried, without a steady boyfriend. The idea that she might be pregnant did not fit into the worldview Helga had built for herself. Nevertheless, she began to observe her daughter more closely. She noticed that Katerina could no longer tolerate certain smells, that she was often tired, and that her clothes fit strangely. One Saturday morning in late January, when Klaus was at a church council meeting and Matthias was supposedly at a friend's house, Helga confronted her daughter. She found Katerina in the bathroom, washing her face after vomiting again. Helga closed the door behind her and asked in a firm voice, "Katerina, are you pregnant?" The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Katerina stared at her mother, unable to speak, panic gathering in her eyes. She tried to say no, but her voice failed her, and instead she burst into tears. Helga felt her legs give way. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub and pressed her hands to her face. All the fear she had tried to suppress became reality in that moment. After a few minutes of silence, she asked in a trembling voice, "Who is the father?" Katerina did not answer. She couldn't. How could she tell her mother the truth? How could she explain that the father of her child was her own brother? Helga repeated the question, this time more insistently, but Katerina just shook her head silently and muttered that she couldn't talk about it. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Hoffman household was frosty. Helga remained silent towards her husband because she wanted to talk to Katerina alone before telling Klaus. She tried several times to get her daughter to tell her the truth, but Katerina refused to name the father. Helga initially suspected a young man from Katerina's circle, perhaps someone from night school or the office. She urged her daughter to take responsibility and hold the man accountable, but Katerina just kept repeating that this was not possible. Matthias sensed the change in the house. His mother was tense, his sister tearful, and although his father didn't know anything yet, there was a heaviness in the air that couldn't be ignored. One evening, when Katerina and he were sitting alone in the living room, she whispered to him that her mother knew. Matthias froze. His first reaction was panic. If his mother knew, it wouldn't be long before his father was informed, and then everything would fall apart. He asked Katerina if she had mentioned his father's name, and she shook her head. Matthias breathed a sigh of relief, but at the same time he knew that this was only a delay. In the second week of February, Helga took her daughter into the bedroom for a talk. She had decided that she could no longer keep Klaus in the dark. That evening after dinner, Helga asked her husband to come into the bedroom because they had something important to discuss. Klaus, who had no idea what was going on, followed her in confusion. When Helga told him that Katerina was pregnant, his face first turned red with anger, then pale with shock. He yelled, "That's impossible! How could this happen?" Helga tried to calm him down, but Klaus stormed out of the room and threw open the door to Katerina's room. What followed was one of the most serious arguments the Hoffmann household had ever seen. Klaus stood in front of his daughter, who was sitting on the bed, and demanded an explanation. Katerina couldn't look him in the eye. Klaus asked who the father was, and when Katerina remained silent, his voice grew louder. He accused her of bringing shame on the family and threatened to throw her out of the house if she didn't tell the truth immediately. Helga tried to intervene, but Klaus was beside himself. Matthias, who heard the shouting, stayed in his room and pressed his hands to his ears, unable to intervene. In the days that followed, a hostile silence reigned in the house. Klaus hardly spoke to Katerina and avoided looking at her. Helga tried to mediate between father and daughter, but she felt overwhelmed. She began to make lists, what needed to be done, what options were available. In 1984, abortion was only legal in Germany under certain conditions, and Katerina was already 4 months pregnant. Adoption after birth seemed like a possible solution, but Katerina would first need medical care. Helga suggested that they go to a gynecologist in Braunschweig, where the family was not known. In mid-February, Helga and Katerina drove to Braunschweig. Katerina had called in sick to work, claiming she had a bad case of the flu. The gynecologist, Dr. Werner, was an older man who had been practicing for 30 years. He examined Katerina and confirmed that she was 16 weeks pregnant. He asked if the child's father had been informed, and Katerina shook her head. Dr. Werner explained that a healthy pregnancy required regular checkups and offered to continue caring for Katerina if she wished. Helga agreed, and they arranged monthly appointments. On the drive back to Wolfsburg, mother and daughter sat silently in the car. Helga tried several times to steer the conversation toward the child's father, but Katerina remained silent. Finally, Helga said in a tired voice, "I don't understand why you can't trust us. We are your family. We want to help you." Katerina cried quietly and replied, "You can't help me. No one can." These words left Helga at a loss. She began to suspect that there was more to this pregnancy than a simple affair, but she couldn't imagine what it could be. In March, Katerina's condition became increasingly obvious. She could no longer hide her pregnancy, even with loose-fitting clothes. She quit her job at the office, saying she needed to take time off for health reasons. Her colleagues were surprised, but no one asked any further questions. She withdrew from night school, stating that she would take her high school diploma at a later date. Her friends tried to keep in touch, but Katerina withdrew and did not answer their calls. During this time, Matthias began to suffer from enormous pressure. He had started his internship at Volkswagen and was working in the development department, but his thoughts were constantly with Katerina. He made mistakes at work, forgot appointments, and seemed distracted. His supervisor, Mr. Lorenz, spoke to him about it and asked if everything was okay. Matthias assured him that it was only a temporary phase, but inside he felt torn. He knew he had to take responsibility for what had happened, but he saw no way out. At the end of March, during another examination in Braunschweig, Dr. Werner noticed that something was wrong with the pregnancy. The fetus was developing more slowly than expected, and some parameters were outside the norm. He recommended an ultrasound examination at a larger hospital to obtain more accurate information. A week later, Helga and Katharina drove to the University Hospital in Hanover, where specialized diagnostics were performed. The results were disturbing. The doctor cautiously explained that there were signs of possible genetic abnormalities that could lead to physical malformations. He asked if there were any hereditary diseases in the family, and Helga said no. The doctor hesitated, then asked if there was a possibility that the child's parents were related. This question hit Helga like a blow. She stared at the doctor, unable to answer, and then slowly turned to Katharina. At that moment, she began to understand. Katharina lowered her gaze and began to tremble. Helga felt dizzy. She asked the doctor to leave them alone for a moment, and when he had left the room, she said in a choked voice, "Katharina, is it Matthias?" Katharina broke down. She cried uncontrollably and nodded. Helga sat there as if petrified. Everything in her resisted this realization, but deep down she had perhaps already suspected it without wanting to admit it. The way Matthias and Katharina treated each other, the secrecy, the long conversations, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. Helga felt as if the ground beneath her was giving way. She had raised 2 children, had done everything to give them a good life, and now she was facing an abyss she would never have thought possible. The drive back to Wolfsburg was agonizing. Helga drove mechanically, her thoughts racing. She had to inform Klaus, but she didn't know how to tell him. When they got home in the late afternoon, Klaus was sitting in the living room reading the newspaper. He looked up and asked how the examination had gone. Helga didn't answer right away. She sent Katharina to her room and asked Klaus to come with her to the kitchen. What she told him left him speechless at first. Then he exploded. Klaus shouted, cried, and banged his fist on the table. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His own children. It was unimaginable, unnatural, a disgrace that destroyed everything he had worked for. He stormed up the stairs, threw open the door to Matthias's room, and yelled at him. Matthias tried to explain, but Klaus wouldn't listen. He ordered his son to leave the house immediately. Matthias packed a bag and left without saying goodbye. Katharina heard everything from her room and cried into her pillow. In the weeks that followed, the Hoffmann family lived in a state of shock. Klaus hardly spoke a word. Helga desperately tried to cope with the situation, and Katharina withdrew completely. Matthias had moved in with a fellow student in Braunschweig, but he called every day to ask about Katharina. It was Helga who answered these calls, because Klaus refused to speak to his son. The neighborhood began to whisper. Mrs. Schultz had noticed that Matthias had moved out and asked Helga if everything was okay. Helga lied and said that Matthias had found a new job in Braunschweig. In May, it became clear that Katharina's pregnancy was causing serious complications. The doctors had carried out further tests and found that the unborn child had multiple malformations. There were problems with heart development, abnormalities in the facial area, and probably neurological damage as well. The doctors explained that these malformations were most likely due to the close genetic relationship between the parents. Children born of incestuous relationships have a significantly increased risk of such complications. Helga listened to these explanations as if through a fog. The reality of what had happened was becoming more and more tangible and at the same time more and more unbearable. The family was now faced with an impossible decision. The pregnancy was too far along for an abortion, and even if it had been legally possible, no one knew if Katharina would agree to it. Helga tried to talk to her daughter about it, but Katerina hardly responded. She sat in her room for hours, staring out the window and talking to no one. The burden of what she had done and the fear of what was to come completely paralyzed her. At the end of May, Klaus and Helga decided that Katerina should not leave the house for the rest of her pregnancy. They wanted to prevent the neighborhood from finding out about the pregnancy and hoped to make the birth as discreet as possible. They told the neighbors that Katerina had gone to stay with relatives in northern Germany for an extended period to work there. Some neighbors were skeptical about this lie, but no one asked any direct questions. The Hoffmann family now lived in self-imposed isolation, trapped in a secret that threatened to overwhelm them. June 1984 brought oppressive heat to Wolfsburg, making the already tense atmosphere in the Hoffmann household even more unbearable. Katerina spent her days locked in her room with the curtains drawn to prevent anyone from seeing her from outside. Her belly was now so large that she could hardly move, and the doctors had advised her to take it easy. The malformations of the unborn child became more apparent with each examination. The fetus's heart showed severe structural abnormalities, and the doctors warned that the child might not survive long after birth. Helga had resumed her role as a caregiver, this time for her own daughter. She brought Katerina food, helped her wash, and tried to get her to talk, but Katerina hardly responded. The young woman had become a shadow of her former self, apathetic and withdrawn. At night, Helga often heard her crying, but when she knocked on the door, Katerina did not answer. The mother felt helpless, torn between pity and a rage she couldn't quite suppress. Klaus had completely turned away from his daughter. He went to work in the morning and came back late in the evening, often with beer in his bag. He had started drinking, something he had never done before. At Volkswagen, colleagues noticed that he was irritable and unfocused. Mr. Seidel, a long-time colleague, once asked him at lunch if everything was okay at home. Klaus replied curtly that he had personal problems he didn't want to talk about. The facade of the perfect family began to crumble at work as well. Matthias, who continued to live in Braunschweig, suffered from unbearable feelings of guilt. He had tried to talk to his father and written several letters, but none of them were answered. His mother allowed him to call once a week to ask about Katerina, but the conversations were short and painful. Matthias couldn't concentrate on his work and eventually lost his internship. His supervisor told him in a direct conversation that he should take some time off to sort out his personal problems. At the beginning of July, Katerina suffered a breakdown. She had heavy bleeding and pain, and Helga had to call an ambulance. At the hospital in Wolfsburg, the doctors determined that Katerina was under extreme stress and that this was endangering the pregnancy. She was admitted for 3 days, and the situation could no longer be completely concealed. A nurse who knew the family naturally noticed Katerina's condition. Helga desperately asked her to be discreet, and the nurse promised to be, but in a small town like Wolfsburg, such secrets did not remain hidden for long. When Katerina returned home, she felt the neighbors' eyes on her. Mrs. Schultz stood at the window and watched Helga lead her daughter into the house. The neighbor had long since begun to form her own opinions. She told her friend Mrs. Koch that something was wrong in the Hoffmann household, that Katerina looked heavily pregnant, and that Matthias had not been home for months. Rumors began to circulate, cautiously at first, then more openly. In the church, which the family had attended so regularly in the past, people were talking about the Hoffmanns. Pastor Müller had heard the rumors and decided to visit the family. One Friday afternoon at the end of July, he rang the doorbell. Helga opened the door and tried to send him away, but the pastor insisted on talking to her. They let him into the living room, and he asked directly if he could help the family. Klaus, who had just come home from work, reacted brusquely and said that these were private matters that were nobody's business. The pastor tried to point out Christian values and forgiveness, but Klaus interrupted him and asked him to leave. After this visit, the family's isolation worsened even further. Klaus and Helga stopped going to church, avoided social events, and hardly spoke to their neighbors. The house on Lessingstrasse, which had once been a symbol of order and prosperity, now looked gloomy and closed off. The curtains remained drawn, the garden grew wild, and no one came to visit any more. Katharina felt time inexorably marching toward the birth. She was afraid of what was to come, but at the same time she wished it would all be over. She imagined what the child would look like, and feelings of guilt overwhelmed her. She had created this life with Matthias, a life that was doomed from the start. At night she lay awake and wondered if the child would suffer, if it would hate her for what she had done. At the end of August, when the summer heat was at its peak, the contractions began. It was the middle of the night, and Katharina screamed in pain. Helga immediately called the emergency doctor, but she knew that the birth would be complicated. The doctors had already warned her that the child would probably have to be delivered by C-section, as its malformations made a natural birth dangerous. Katharina was taken to the hospital, and the long night of waiting began, a night that would seal the fate of the Hoffmann family once and for all. In the early hours of August 28, 1984, a child was born at the Wolfsburg hospital, whose appearance shocked even experienced doctors and nurses. The birth took place by caesarean section, as predicted, and when the baby was born, there was an oppressive silence in the operating room. Dr. Hartmann, who led the operation, immediately handed the newborn to the pediatric nurse, who wrapped it in a prepared cloth. The child breathed weakly, and its cries were barely audible. The malformations were severe. The baby's face showed clear asymmetries, the eyes were unusually wide apart, and the nose was only rudimentarily developed. Adhesions were visible on the head, and the limbs appeared shortened and twisted. The doctors knew immediately that this child would not live long. The heart, already diagnosed as severely damaged before birth, beat irregularly, and breathing was laborious. Katharina was still under anesthesia after the operation when they showed her the child for the first time. When she opened her eyes and saw her baby, she froze. She didn't want to hold it, turned her head away, and began to cry. The nurse tried to find comforting words, but what could one say in such a situation? Helga, who had been sitting in the waiting area, was called into the room. When she saw the child, she had to sit down. All the medical warnings had not prepared her for this sight. Klaus refused to see the child. He sat in the car in the hospital parking lot and stared into space. When Helga came to him later and tried to talk to him, he just shook his head. He didn't say a word, started the engine, and drove home. That night, he slept in the living room with a bottle of liquor next to him. The baby survived only 48 hours. During that short time, it received intensive care, but the doctors could do nothing but delay its death. On the third day, the morning of August 30th, the monitors showed a flat line. The little heart had stopped beating. Katharina was with her child when it died. She held its tiny hand and whispered over and over, "I'm sorry." News of the child's death spread quickly throughout the hospital, and with it came rumors about the circumstances of its conception. A nurse who had spoken to the family told a colleague about her suspicions, and that colleague passed it on. Within a few days, half of Wolfsburg knew that Katharina Hoffmann had given birth to a deformed child, and that there were rumors of incestuous relationships in the family. The funeral was attended only by the closest family members. Only Klaus, Helga, and Katharina were present, as well as Pastor Müller, who had insisted on conducting the ceremony. The small grave in the forest cemetery bore no name, only the dates: August 28th, 1984, August 30th, 1984. Katharina stood frozen at the grave and did not cry. She felt empty, as if a part of her had died with the child. Matthias only found out about the birth and death of the child days later. His mother had called him and told him in a monotone voice, Matthias broke down on the phone. He wanted to come to Wolfsburg, but Helga told him it would be better if he stayed away. Klaus would not be able to bear seeing him. In the weeks following the funeral, the Hoffmann family's life became hell. The neighbors no longer spoke to them, people whispered in the supermarket when Helga went shopping, and Klaus was urged to take early retirement at work. The shame was too great, the town too small. The perfect family was irrevocably destroyed. The fall of 1984 brought a coldness to Wolfsburg that went far beyond the weather. The Hoffmann family existed in name only. Klaus had cleared out his office at Volkswagen and spent his days in an armchair in front of the TV, a bottle within reach. He hardly spoke anymore, and when he did, it was only in short, bitter sentences. The neighbors avoided any contact, and even old friends crossed the street when they saw Helga. Katerina rarely left her room. She had lost 20 kilograms and looked like a ghost. Dr. Werner from Braunschweig had prescribed her antidepressants, but she took them irregularly. Helga tried to get her daughter to eat, to talk, to live, but Katerina hardly responded. She sat at the window and stared out, as if waiting for something that would never come. In October, the family received a letter from the health department. There were questions about the circumstances of the pregnancy and the genetic abnormalities of the deceased child. A social worker was sent to investigate the situation. Mrs. Neumann, a strict woman in her early 50s, arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She spoke with Klaus and Helga, asked probing questions, and took notes. When she asked about the child's father, Helga remained silent. Klaus got up and left the room. Miss Neumann also visited Katerina. The young woman sat motionless on her bed and answered in a monotone voice. Yes, she had been the mother. No, she did not want to talk about the father. The social worker saw the empty medicine boxes on the nightstand and the curtains that were permanently drawn. In her report, she noted, "Severe depressive episode, risk of suicide, cannot be ruled out." Matthias tried several times to go to Wolfsburg, but each time he only drove to the outskirts of the city and then turned back. He couldn't muster the courage to enter the house. He had found a temporary job in a workshop in Braunschweig, but his life was directionless. He drank, slept poorly, and had nightmares. In one of these dreams, he held the deformed baby in his arms, and it opened its eyes and looked at him. At the end of November, what many had feared happened. Katerina took an overdose of pills. Helga found her unconscious in her bed in the morning, an empty pack of sleeping pills on the nightstand. The emergency doctor arrived quickly, and Katerina was taken to the hospital, where her stomach was pumped. She survived, but when she woke up, she cried because she was still alive. After this incident, Katerina was admitted to the psychiatric ward of the University Hospital in Hanover. Klaus signed the papers without looking at his daughter. Helga accompanied her there and handed her over to the doctors. Katerina did not resist. She let everything happen to her as if she were already dead. Klaus and Helga were left alone in the house. They hardly spoke to each other, and when they did, it was only about practical matters. The love that had once bound them together was suffocated under the weight of shame and pain. Klaus reproached Helga for not having taken better care of her. Helga accused Klaus of always having been too strict, of not allowing the children to turn to her. In December, shortly before Christmas, they received another blow. Someone had told the local newspaper about the story, and a journalist began to investigate. He spoke to neighbors, nurses, and the social worker. The family found out about it through a call from the newspaper asking for a statement. Klaus hung up without saying a word. The article never appeared because the editor-in-chief decided the story was too sensitive, but the damage was done. Now the whole of Wolfsburg knew for sure what had happened. The Hoffmann family had become the talk of the town, a cautionary tale, a scandal that was whispered about behind closed doors. The year 1985 brought no relief for the Hoffmann family, only a slow dissolution of what had once been. Katharina stayed in the psychiatric clinic in Hanover for 6 months. The doctors diagnosed her with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic depression. When she was discharged in June, she did not return to Wolfsburg. Helga had rented a small room for her in Celle, far enough away from the past. Katharina worked as a cleaner in a hotel and lived a secluded life. She never spoke about what had happened. Klaus and Helga sold the house on Lessingstrasse in the fall of 1985 for far less than its value. No one wanted to live in a house burdened by such a history. They moved to Bremen, where no one knew them. Klaus found work in a small auto repair shop, and Helga took on shifts at the hospital again. They lived in the same apartment, but they had become strangers. Klaus died in 1991 of liver failure, a consequence of his years of drinking. Matthias disappeared without a trace in 1986. He had broken off all contact with his family and changed his name. There were rumors that he had gone to southern Germany, but no one knew for sure. Helga tried for years to find him, but he did not want to be found. In Wolfsburg, people were still talking about the Hoffmann case years later. It became a kind of urban legend, a story that parents told their children to warn them about the dangers of secrets. The small grave in the forest cemetery was regularly tended, but no one knew by whom. Katharina lived until 2003. She died of heart failure in her apartment in Celle, alone and forgotten. Only Helga was present at her funeral, an old woman who stood broken with guilt and grief in front of her daughter's grave. The case of the Hoffmann family shows how secrets, shame, and social pressure can destroy a family. It is a story with no winners, only victims, not only the deformed child who had no chance to live, but also the people who had to live with the consequences of their actions. At a time when such things were not talked about, when families maintained their facades at all costs, the tragedy was perhaps inevitable. But that does not make it any less painful.